Salutations YouTube, welcome back. First off, I'm going to say I'm sorry about last week's video of how short it was, how shit it was. I was tired, I did not have enough time to do any research. But this time I've actually put some research into it, and it dawned on me. Instead of doing the killer I was originally meant to be doing, I can't do a serial killer playlist without Jack the Ripper, right? So the original killer I fucked off, so this one is going to be about Jack the Ripper. One of my favourite cases, this. Anyway, before we start, I just want to say, get yourself a drink, get yourself a snack, make yourself comfortable. Today, I'm being the old British way, doing the old British way, and having a nice cup of tea. Without further ado, let's begin. Jack the Ripper qualifies as the first true serial killer because his 10-week campaign of murder was a media event. Indeed, he courted the press, writing to the newspapers and giving them his sobriquet. I hope I'm saying that right. He even sent them body parts of his victims that had been excised during the bizarre mutilation of their corpses. The Ripper's murderous activities gripped the public's imagination like no single individual's crimes before them, and London was paralysed by fear. Again, thanks to the mass media, Jack the Ripper was soon famous in New York, San Francisco, Paris, Sydney and Berlin, as he was in London. The painter Vincent van Gogh had been avidly following the accounts of his deeds in the French newspapers before he sliced off part of his ear. Some biographers have actually concluded that he was influenced by the Ripper's method of dissection. Fun fact for you. Whitechapel was the Ripper's stomping ground. In 1888, when the killing started, there were 62 brothels in the London district, along with 233 boarding houses that catered for prostitutes and their clients. On top of that, there was also an army of older, pox-ridden, middle-aged alcoholics who offered their sexual favours in alleys and doorways for the price of a slug of gin. On the night of 3rd of April 1888, the 45-year-old Emma Elizabeth Smith solicited a well-dressed gentleman. Later that night, she collapsed in the arms of a police constable, saying that she had been attacked by 4 men. A foreign object had been shoved up her vagina and she died a few hours later. What connected her death to the Ripper's subsequent murders, however, was the fact that her ear had been cut off. Here today, gone tomorrow. Then on the night of 7th of August 1888, Martha Tabram, whatever her name is, I'm sorry, she was stabbed to death as well. There were 39 wounds on her corpse, mainly around her breasts and vagina, the areas of the body that the Ripper liked to mutilate when he had the time. Both Martha Tabram and Emma Elizabeth Smith had been attacked from behind. The police assumed that, like the Ripper's later victims, the women had turned their backs on their client and had hoisted up their skirts for anal sex when they were attacked. It is not known for certain that these 2 women were killed by Jack the Ripper, but their killer was never caught and their murders shared many similarities with the Ripper's slayings. The first woman definitely to have been killed by Jack the Ripper was the 42-year-old Polly Nichols, whose body was found in Bucks Row, Whitechapel at 3:15 a.m. on 31st of August 1888. Although she had fought her attacker, she had not cried out, for her murder had taken place under the window of a sleeping woman who had not been woken by the struggle. She also appeared to have turned her back on her attacker, who slashed her throat twice, so savagely that he almost decapitated her. Nice. There were deep wounds around her sexual organs too, although no body parts had been removed. The doctors who examined the corpse speculated that the attacker had some medical knowledge and was possibly a doctor himself. The police concluded that Molly had turned away from her killer during the yeah. Oh fucking hell! I cannot read my writing. Assignation, which is a common practice among London street prostitutes at the time. She had therefore had her back to her killer when he pulled his knife, which was why she had not cried out. He had then put the knife to her throat and pushed her forward onto it, which explained the depth of the wound. It also meant that the blood from the arteries and veins in her neck would have spurted forward, away from the killer, enabling him to escape from the scene unsullied. With the murder of Polly Nichols, the police realised that they had a maniac on their hands who seemed to be motivated by a hatred of prostitutes. Detectives were accordingly sent into the East End to search for men who mistreated prostitutes. The name Leather Apron came up several times during the investigation, and a shoemaker was arrested. I forgot his name. Although he used a leather apron and sharp knives in his trade, his family swore that he had been home on the 3 occasions on which women had been attacked in this manner. On the 8th of September 1888, in various pubs in Whitechapel, the 47-year-old Annie Chapman bragged that the killer would meet his match if he ever came near her. She was wrong, however. She was subsequently seen talking to a gentleman in the street. Having apparently struck a bargain, they went off arm in arm. Half an hour later, she was found lying dead in an alleyway. Her head was connected to her body only by a strand of flesh. Her intestines had been thrown over her right shoulder, and the flesh from her lower abdomen over her left. Her kidneys and ovaries had also been removed. I don't know how they suspected normal people of doing that at first, because that's not something normal people can do, is it? Normal people cannot just remove body parts. Anyway, like they said, they was investigating people who, basically anyone who cut up bodies for a living, or always worked with blades and whatnot. The killer had left a blood-soaked envelope bearing the crest of the Sussex Regiment. It had been reported that Martha Tabram had been seen in the company of a soldier shortly before her death, and the newspapers now speculated that her wounds could have been caused by a bayonet or an army knife. 3 weeks after the death of Annie Chapman, the Central News Agency received a letter that gloated about both the murder and the tantalising clues that had been left. The author expressed his regret that the killer had not been written in the victim's blood, which had gone thick like glue, and promised to send the ear of his next victim. The letter was signed Jack the Ripper. At last, the murderer had a name. On the 30th of September 1888, the Central News Agency received another letter from the Ripper, apologising for not having enclosed an ear as promised. But nevertheless, he had exciting news for the papers. He wrote he was going to commit a double, which basically was 2 murders in one night. At 1 a.m. on the night on which the letter had been received, the 45-year-old Long Liz Stride was a Swedish prostitute whose real name was Elizabeth Gustafsdotter, was found lying dead in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slashed. The delivery man, who also discovered her body, heard her attacker escaping over the cobblestones. At around the same time, the 43-year-old prostitute Catherine Eddowes was being thrown out of Bishopsgate police station, where she had been held for being drunk and disorderly. As she walked towards Houndsditch, she met Jack the Ripper, who cut her throat, slashed her face and cut her ear, though not severing it completely. He also opened up her stomach, pulled out her intestines and threw them over her shoulder. Her left kidney was found to be missing altogether. The murder of 2 women in one night, so soon after a letter from the Ripper promising just that, sent London into a panic. Queen Victoria demanded action, but the police had no idea where to begin. Fun fact, this is when they wanted the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes to turn to, but obviously he didn't make his debut until 1891. In a blaze of publicity, East End resident George Lusk set up the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee with which to patrol the streets. For his pains, 2 weeks later, Mr. Lusk received a small package through the post. It was from Jack the Ripper and contained half of Catherine Eddowes' kidney. The other half, an accompanying note explained, had been fried and eaten. On hearing this, Queen Victoria concluded that the Ripper must be a foreigner, as no Englishman would behave in such a beastly way, she asserted. A cabinet meeting was called to discuss the matter, and the government consequently ordered checks on all of the ships that were tied up in London docks. This action proved merely to be a huge waste of police manpower, and in the meantime the Ripper continued on his grisly business. On the night of 9th of November 1888, Mary Kelly was seen soliciting a well-dressed gentleman on the streets. Mary was unlike the Ripper's previous victims, being attractive and young, just 24. She was not a full-time prostitute, only going onto the streets occasionally when she needed to pay the rent. She was furthermore killed indoors and was also the only one of the Ripper's victims to cry out. Despite her screams, the Ripper was not disturbed and spent more than an hour going about his dreadful task. Mary Kelly's clothes were found folded neatly on a chair, from which it was assumed that she had brought her gentleman back to her room and had taken off her clothes in readiness for sex. The theory was that it was then that he had pulled a knife. Unlike the Ripper's other victims, Mary had been facing her killer and had cried out on seeing the knife. Sometime between 3:30 and 4 a.m, a woman who had been sleeping in the room above her had heard Mary scream, "Oh, murder," before going back to sleep. Okay, if I hear someone shout, "Oh, murder," I would not go, I'm going back to sleep. I can't say call the police because there weren't no phones back then, but I'd do something about it. At least try and help. Not help commit the murder, obviously, but help stop the murder. Anyway, I'm digressing. The Ripper slashed Mary's throat, almost decapitating her. As she was facing him, some of her blood must have splashed onto his clothes, which were found burnt in the stove. Then the Ripper set about his dissection work. He cut off both her breasts and put them on the table, placing her severed nose and flesh from her thighs and legs alongside. Her forehead and legs were stripped of flesh and her abdomen was slashed open. Her liver and intestines were removed and her hands shoved into the gaping hole in her belly. Mary was 3 months pregnant when she died. There was blood around the window from which the Ripper was thought to have escaped. He would have been naked except for a long cloak and boots. The next day, the rent man called and discovered Mary's mutilated corpse. He called the police, or went to get the police even, who were horrified and, once again, baffled. Mary Kelly was the last woman who we know to have been a victim of the Ripper. Other murders that followed that may either have been his handiwork or the work of a copycat. In June 1889, for example, the headless corpse of Elizabeth Jackson, who was a prostitute who worked in the Chelsea area, was found floating in the Thames. The following month, the body of Alice Mackenzie, who was a prostitute working in Whitechapel, was found. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear and her sexual organs cut out. Frances Cole, a streetwalker known as Carity Nell because of her flaming red hair, was also found dead in Whitechapel with her throat cut and slashes around her abdomen. Her assailant may have been planning a more thorough mutilation, but had been disturbed by a policeman who reported having seen a man stooping over the body who had run away before the constable could get a good look at him. The newspapers had already produced an image of the Ripper that had seized the public's imagination. It was based on a description given by the friend of Mary Kelly, who had seen her with a client on the night of her death. She said that he was 5'6", which is 1.65 metres tall, I think, about 35 years old and well dressed, and that he had a gold watch chain dangling from his waistcoat pocket. I say, if you're being toppled by a 5'6" man, then fuck me. He's 6 inches shorter than me. Mary had been heard in conversation with the man. "Will you be all right for what I have told you?" he had asked. "All right, my dear," she had replied, taking him by the arm. "Come along, you will be comfortable," she said. A few hours later, a roast chestnut vendor had seen a man matching the same description, wearing a long cloak and silk hat with a thin moustache that turned up at the ends. Ominously, he was carrying a black bag which could have contained surgical instruments. "Have you heard that there has been another murder?" the man had asked. "I have," the chestnut vendor had replied. "I know more of it than you do," the man had said as he walked away. Okay, that's a red flag there. The Ripper was never caught, and over the past 100 years, an enormous number of theories had been put forward regarding who he was. The police alone came up with 176 suspects, of whom perhaps the most likely was a Russian physician, Dr. Alexander Pedachenko, who had worked under an assumed name at Camberwell Clinic that had catered to prostitutes, including 4 of the victims. He had died in an asylum in St. Petersburg after killing a woman in the Russian town. A document naming him as the Ripper was said to have been found in the basement of Rasputin's home in St. Petersburg after the monk's murder in 1916. Skeptics, however, have pointed out that the house did not have a basement. Another popular suspect was Dr. Stanley, who was a Harley Street physician who had contracted syphilis from a prostitute called Kelly in Whitechapel. It was said that he had gone about killing prostitutes out of vengeance until he hit upon the right one. Stanley subsequently fled to Buenos Aires in Argentina, where he died in 1929 after supposedly confessing all to a student. At the time of the murders, Jewish immigrants to the East End were blamed for having perpetrated them. It was said that they represented ritual Jewish slaughters and had been performed by a shochet, that's a butcher who kills animals according to Talmudic law. The shochet theory was given some credence by a strange message that was found scrawled on a wall in Whitechapel after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, which said, "The Jews are not the men that will be blamed for nothing." It was also noted that Jews, spelled Juwes, was a Masonic spelling of Jews, which gave rise to the theory that the murders had been part of a Masonic rite. The police commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, himself a leading Mason, had the graffiti removed in order to prevent the inflammation of anti-Jewish sentiments. He resigned from the police force after the murder of Mary Kelly, admitting his utter failure to solve the case. A Polish Jew named Kosminski, who lived in Whitechapel and had furthermore threatened to slice up prostitutes, was a suspect, but later became insane and died in an asylum. Another Polish immigrant, Severin Klosowicz, whose alias was George Chapman, was also under suspicion. A barber and a surgeon in Whitechapel, he kept sharp knives for bloodletting and removal of warts and moles. Now, he was a barber. Who wouldn't want to have a close shave with him, right? He also poisoned 3 of his mistresses and went to the gallows in 1903. A further suspect was Thomas Cutbush, who was arrested after the murder of Frances Cole for stabbing women in the buttocks. Now that is a fucking pain in the arse. He also died in a mental institution too. A newspaper reporter named Rosalind Donston wrote to the police in 1888 accusing Dr. Morgan Davies, who was a surgeon at the London Hospital in Whitechapel, of being the Ripper. Yet Donston himself was a suspect, a failed doctor and a drug addict. He was said by some to have killed the women in order to give his career a fillip. It was claimed that his stories that he published in the newspapers contained details about the murders that were never released by the police. Donston subsequently became a Satanist. His fellow devil worshipper, Alistair Crowley, claimed that he had ritually murdered the women in an attempt to become invisible. Didn't see that coming. I'll give you a second there, just to process the shit joke. The insomniac G. Wentworth Bell Smith, who lived at 27 Sun Street off Finsbury Square, became a suspect because he rallied against prostitutes, saying that they should all be drowned. For his part, Frederick Bailey Deeming confessed to the Ripper's murders. Deeming had murdered his wife and children in England and then had fled to Australia, where he had killed his second wife. He had been about to murder a third when he was arrested in Melbourne. It is thought that his confession was an attempt to postpone, if not evade, his trip to the gallows. Another popular suspect was the Lambeth poisoner, Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, who poisoned a number of prostitutes during the 1890s. Before he was hanged, he told his executioner, "I am Jack the..." just as the trapdoor opened. The police's prime suspect was Montague John Druitt. He was an Oxford graduate and a scion of a once healthy family. After failing as a barrister, Druitt became a school teacher. Unable to keep his homosexual urges under control, he was dismissed for molesting a boy. He then moved to Whitechapel, where he was seen walking the streets. In December 1888, his body was fished out of the Thames. There were stones in his pocket and he appeared to have drowned himself. And that was a month after the last Ripper murder. Somewhat surprisingly, the secretary of William Booth, the latter the founder of the Salvation Army, also found himself on the list of suspects. Apparently he had said Carrie Tidell will be the first to go a few days before the slaying of Frances Cole. Another man, the alcoholic railway worker Thomas Solder, was arrested after the murder of Alice Mackenzie. He also knew Frances Cole, but was released due to lack of evidence. Although Sherlock Holmes was not around to solve the case, his creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was, and used all of his considerable powers of reasoning to deduce that the Ripper was a woman. According to his theory, Jill the Ripper was a midwife who had gone mad after having been sent to prison for performing illegal abortions. The spiritualist William Lees staged a seance for Queen Victoria in an attempt to discover who the Ripper was. But the results frightened him so much that he fled to the continent. The Ripper, he believed, was none other than the Queen's physician, Sir William Gull. The theory later developed that it was Prince Edward, the Duke of Clarence, Victoria's grandson and heir to the throne. He had secretly married a shop girl called Crook, who had birthed him a child, which was placed in the care of one Mary Kelly. Gull and some of his Masonic cronies, it was said, went about killing prostitutes until they got to Kelly and retrieved the child. Gull's papers were examined by Dr. Thomas Stowell and were discovered the name of Prince Eddie, who died of syphilis before he could ascend the throne, as Jack the Ripper. Another suspect was James Kenneth Stephen, the prince's tutor and possibly also his lover. as the pair frequented homosexual clubs in Whitechapel together. The painter Frank Miles was an inmate of It was something to do with Oscar Wilde. He was also named as the Ripper, but the truth is that the identity of Jack the Ripper will probably never be known. One of my favourite theories I saw was a diary found in Liverpool in 1992, and in the diary it said it wrote about going on a killing spree after his wife had been unfaithful to him, killing prostitutes. And in the diary it said, "I leave my name that all know of me, so history do tell what love can do to a gentleman born. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." And if I haven't mentioned it, the owner of the diary was called James Maybrick. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that video. I've put more research into it this time. And if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, it'd be much appreciated. Subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot. We're on 108 now. I would like to get higher, but that's up to you people, of course. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night and peace.